Thank you so much for the kind invitation and for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be on MorphoTalk. So today I wanted to bring you on a journey engineering swarms across scale from the nano world for cancer treatment to larger robots that might be used for environmental monitoring and logistics. But really, I want to think about how we make these swarms more than a proof of concept in the lab and move them into the real world. And part of that is going to be to make them trustworthy. And so I also wanted to highlight some of the results of a recent project that finished that was led by Shane Windsor around how do we make trustworthy systems that evolve in functionality, which typically we might not trust, but how do we do these systems that are a bit more sophisticated in a trustworthy way? And my source of inspiration, like many swarm engineers, is this flock of birds and their ability to do beautiful, complex dances in the sky. And what I find fascinating in these systems is if you continue to add birds to the flock, it continues to fly, so it can scale to huge numbers. If a bird falls to the ground, the whole flock doesn't crash, and so they're robust to individual failures. And together they can do more than the sum of their parts. So for example, they might be better at avoiding predators. So these are all interesting features for engineered applications, the scalability, the adaptability, the robustness. How do they achieve that? They achieve that by every bird reacting to the local environment, to the local world around them. And there is no leader bird in this flock telling every bird what to do. It's fully distributed and self-organized. And there's examples of swarms like these everywhere in nature, whether it's the flock of birds or ants as they create a trail to your picnic table, or bees as they make decisions about their next nest site, or indeed our ability to grow fully functioning human beings from just a couple cells. Now, the challenge for swarm engineers is, given a collective behavior you're interested in, how do you go and design that individual agent and its local interactions? And typically we do that either using bioinspiration, or increasingly we use machine learning tools like artificial evolution to automatically design those agents and their local rules to give rise to collective behaviors. Now, the nice thing is when you go about doing that, what you are able to do is take those rules and put them on artificial systems such as robots. So here what you're looking at is some examples where bioinspiration has been used to control swarms of robots that we've worked on over the years. In the top left, you see a swarm of flying robots that are flocking, and they're creating these beautiful circular topologies over time using flocking rules. On the right, you're looking at little kilobot robots, simple robots with basic local communication that are able to buzz around in this demonstration. And they're creating trails inspired from how ants create trails to your picnic table. You can see that trail being formed right now. In the bottom left, you're looking at 400 of those kilobot robots, and these robots are making decisions here between blue or red. Blue is the correct decision to reach, and this is inspired from how honeybees reach decisions about their next nest site. And on the right, this is work with colleagues in biology who study embryogenesis, our ability to grow functioning shapes in the human body during the embryo development. And we've taken inspiration from that to make a blob of cellular robots. Each robot here serves as a cell. They have little chemicals called morphogens. They exchange that through the network of robots and create reaction diffusion networks. And as a result of that, you grow limbed structures, a little bit like you would grow fingers in an embryo over time. And because all these systems are self-organized, you can damage them, you can put obstacles in the environment, you can do a number of things to them, and they manage to adapt to what is happening. So we've reached the point in the swarm engineering world where I feel we have the capacity to build hardware. We have the capacity to design algorithms, whether it's bio-inspired or using machine learning tools. And now is the right time to start thinking about how we bring these swarms to people, how we go about making these swarms a reality outside of the laboratory. And it's the right time to be doing this. So this is work by some of our colleagues looking at the future of swarm robotics. They highlight things like 2020-25, the first demonstration of robot swarms capable of autonomously learning a behavior for any given problem. So that ability to find those local rules is on the horizon. 2020 to 2030 for civil applications of robot swarms for precision agriculture, infrastructure monitoring and maintenance. They also mention military applications, which is worth highlighting and thinking about. 2025 to 2040 first space exploration mission on the moon and Mars with miniature rovers, exploring an area and demonstrating construction abilities. So you can also look at different applications like construction, infrastructure monitoring that are applicable actually more broadly. And then 2030 to 2050 miniature robot swarms demonstrating targeted drug delivery within the human body. And so this is the horizon for swarm robotics. I actually think there's much more we could do within this space, but just worth highlighting some of the applications people are thinking of. And I wanted to bring you on a journey of the applications that we're working on from the nanoscale to the macro scale. At the nanoscale, we've been looking at how 10 to the power 13, so huge numbers of nanoparticles, can be used as useful vehicles for the delivery of drugs or diagnostics to tumor tissues. And these nanoparticles, because of their nano size, are quite interesting in terms of their ability to leak out of vessels into certain tumor tissues. And for us as swarm engineers, the question is, how do we program them? And the way we program them is by thinking about how you design the particle and how that particle's design impacts its ability to work in the 10 to the power 13. And the laboratory where I spent time over in Boston made particles, Sangeeta Bhattia's laboratory, made particles of different sizes, of different shapes. You could change the charge of that particle. You could make the particle energy reactive. You could use magnetic fields or light, for example, to activate it. You could decorate that particle with molecules that allowed them to interact with each other or with receptors on certain cancer cells. And you could load them with certain drugs that you could deliver in a more or less controlled fashion. So actually, the way you program these nanoparticles is by turning the knobs on the design of these nanoparticles so that when you inject the 10 to the power 13, you get the desired collective behavior you want. And that could go from improving the tissue distribution within a tumor for particles that are currently already approved to understand their dynamics, to things that are more sophisticated, like making particles that can make decisions. Now, the challenge, like always in swarm engineering, is how do you turn those knobs so that you design the right particle and its interactions? And so to do that, we've built a framework as part of a big European project called EvoNano, where you specify tumor properties, you grow a virtual tumor, and then this digital twin of that tumor, you chop it up into slices, and these slices are used as simulation environments on which you can optimize a nanoparticle design. And we use artificial evolution to turn those knobs on the design of the nanoparticle to optimally treat in simulation those tumor slices. So this is one aspect that we're working on at the nanoscale. And as part of that, because I wanted to focus a bit on how we get these into reality, Matimba Swana and my colleague in bioethics, John Ives, have been working on building a framework around the first human clinical trials of nanoswarm technology so that when this technology comes around, we're ready for it. And what's interesting is when you ask both patients and participants more broadly, many of them would engage in a clinical trial of nanoswarm technology. So this idea that people are worried or fear the technology when you put the swarm word in it, the swarm word was in these surveys and these discussions. And actually there is an openness to the technology, but it needs to be done carefully and there needs to be a framework around this. So we're running a literature review, interviews, focus groups, and really trying to build a thematic analysis around this so that we design it in the right way, at least in terms of what we're understanding and knowing now. At the micro scale, we're looking at how we control swarms of skin cells. And there we're looking at if we can use light as a mechanism to activate cells and drive their collective behavior in the context of wound healing. So we've created this device over the past 5-6 years called the DOME, for Dynamic Optical Microenvironment. And this DOME is all open hardware. You can find it at the opendome.org. There's many versions of it because it's very modular. We keep adapting it. But really what it is a projector that projects thousands of pixels of light and a camera. So that projects it on our skin cells, but it could be another swarm. And we've done fun work on micro swarms of algae, micro swarms of protocells, so many other areas of activation. And then you look at those micro swarms and you change what you project on the microswarm. So it gives you a closed loop feedback control of microswarm systems. In our work with Eugenia Pedini, we've been working, and as well with Helmut Hauser, we've been working on how we can drive the wound closing in these systems. So here what you're looking at is a scratch wound in a Petri dish in our dome, and we're illuminating the light the edge of this wound to help drive the wound healing process. And we're currently doing trials to assess whether that speeds up the wound healing or not, which is what my colleague Eugenia Padini had found in her previous research. And again, in terms of how you make these systems trustworthy, we're engaging with patients, with doctors who deal with patients who have chronic wounds, trying to understand what the benefits of such a device would be, because ultimately we'd like this, because it's quite low cost, to be something you could put your arm in, if that's where your wound was, and you could do something in the home. You could do maybe even a wearable, something that you wear that heals your wound. And just thinking about what the implications of that are. Are people comfortable with a system that's zapping your cells, trying to optimize wound healing, maybe even doing machine learning so they can personalize it to your particular wound? And what does that offer us in terms of both closing these wounds that are sometimes chronic and difficult to close, but maybe avoid scars and maybe design the wound healing process as well? At the macro scale, moving up more to the robotics, the classical robotics world, I'd say, we're looking at how we can use swarms of robots to do things like monitor the environment. And if you're in the UK, you might have seen in the news, there's this drone called the Ultra, designed by Wind Racers and Distributed Avionics, was in Antarctica as part of this project that we're also a partner on, to basically, what's interesting with this aircraft is that it can travel 1,000 kilometers and it can carry 100 kilos to 500 kilos of payload. So that means the BAS, the British Antarctic Survey, could put fancy sensors on there, and that allowed them for more interesting environmental monitoring with these aircrafts and some of the smaller drones that you typically see. On our project, we're focused on, can we use swarms of these ultra drones to monitor the environment for wildfires? And so we're looking at areas the scale of California, designing algorithms to see how many robots would we need to cover 24/7 California in the fire season. And it's not that many, actually. Probably something like 30, 40 aircrafts would do the job. And beyond that, because there's a payload, we're also working on, can we mitigate the fires? Can we drop a water payload or an extinguishing payload on those fires before they get out of control? And we've just entered the X Prize competition for wildfire mitigation with this technology. So we're hoping to do a demonstration in spring with a real fire. We have firefighters involved and have been engaging with them. We've spoken to 50 firefighters over the years of this project to see how they would become drone operators, how they would engage with the technology. And we're hoping we can move this forward a little bit. This is my colleague, Giorgio Tsuma and Lucio Salinas. And here what they're looking at is not just the algorithms and the technology to deploy these, but again, the trustworthy aspect of how do you design the interface so that the operators feel like they're in control of the swarm, but also feel like they don't need to micromanage every individual. And so ultimately this gets adopted within the pipeline of firefighters in the way they currently get deployed to fire sites. With biologists, we're looking at how we can design swarms of robots to image things that we currently can't image. And so this is work looking at basking sharks that have these really impressive raker gills. They basically swim in the water with their mouth open, and that allows them to gather loads of microplanktons. And that's how they feed themselves. And biologists have been fascinated by the fact that they can capture and filter, basically just capturing the good stuff, their food, and filtering out the rest. And so what's been interesting with this project is trying to understand how you image these basking sharks. And so what we've gone is designed this robot. It's about like a meter in size, and it has stereo cameras underneath. And then because it sits on the surface, that's easier to coordinate the swarm, and it can also have imaging capabilities. And so these are our first trials from last spring, just getting close-ups of some of these raker gills. This project is also with people who study material science to see if we can make filters to capture microplastics, because it's similar size to the algae. So trying to understand more about, can sort of see how these raker gills work. And we're doing new trials this spring with hopefully 3 of these that are automatically coordinated around the basking shark, so that we get 3D images with stereo on each robot of this environment. And quite keen to know what other people might like to do with this robot. And then on the social side, we've been working on swarms that are meant to help people interact and think. So these robots are called tiles. They're about 10 centimeters in size. They're screens on wheels, and we've used them in many ways. So we've used them to brainstorm about climate change at a mall in Bristol, where people could enter what they thought they could do to fight climate change. And then those opinions served as physical avatars on the robot. So when other people came, they could see what other people thought before them. We've used them as Post-it notes, so you can in free form write what you would do to fight climate change on them, and then they cluster based on the topics that were highlighted, so an automatic sort of brainstorming tool. And we use them with kids as puzzles. So you form a puzzle, you tap them, they all scatter, and then the humans need to work with each other and with the robots to reform the puzzles. And then finally, we've also been working on logistics. I shouldn't say finally, because I'm probably going to say finally further on in the talk, but we've been looking at logistics. And I think when you think of logistics, you probably think of Amazon warehouses, or you think of Ocado if you're in the UK. And those robots live in very structured environments. There's been loads of investment in the infrastructure and in the R&D that goes into making these robots a reality. And we're looking at something slightly different. We're looking at the logistics in the world of unmet needs, places that would use robots. And actually, we did quite a few interviews with people in logistics who don't use robots. And there is a desire to use robots. They just don't know how they would work in their messy everyday environments. And I think that's a potential area where swarms can shine, because they don't require central control. They don't require infrastructure to be set up. They just need to react to the local world around them and follow a series of rules. And that could give them what they need to be usable out of the box. So we're looking at small retail, pop-up warehouses, cities, reconfigurable manufacturing places that are typically messy. And I just want to walk you through this thought experiment so that you can understand why I think it makes sense. And it's a thought experiment around a cloakroom. So imagine you arrive at a conference and you deposit your jacket or your suitcase in a cloakroom. Now you could design this cloakroom, if you're the cloakroom robot operator, in a centralized way. And in that context, you would arrive, you would create a map of the cloakroom, you would get your robots out, you'd put a central computer in there, and then users would arrive to the central computer and say, here's my jacket. And that central computer would say, okay, robot 1, 2, 3, follow this trajectory, pick up this jacket. You would say, okay, robot 1, 2, 3, go and deposit it in this location, store that location in a database. And at the end of the day, you would come back to that central computer and request your jacket, and the same thing would happen. And so in that exercise, there's a map of the environment, there's a database, there's a that always needs to be up to date, there's a central computer that always needs to work. There's the need to think about every robot in your system and how you coordinate them. If you did it in a distributed, swarmy way, the way you would set up this cloakroom in an out-of-the-box manner would be you put a line on the floor and the robots know to not pass that line, so they're in the cloakroom area. You would have a Bluetooth app, and the user would arrive with their Bluetooth app and say, hey, I have a jacket. Nearby robot would come to them and you'd put a jacket in that robot's box. That box gets deposited anywhere in the cloakroom environment. And at the end of the day, you arrive with your Bluetooth app and you go somewhere along the cloakroom and you say, hey, has any robot seen my jacket? And a bit like humans that look around for your jacket, because there's enough robots, they would find it basically, because there's enough robots to look around, pick up your jacket and bring it back to you. So in that world, there's no map of the environment, there's no global communication. You can bring more robots or less robots to the system. There's no database, so you could technically go and pick up your jacket. It would not disrupt the system in any way. And everything is self-organized to a certain extent, but I would claim more out of the box. The challenge and the reason these don't exist is that to be usable out of the box, robots need to understand the local world around them. And so over the past 4 years with Toshiba, we've been designing in our lab this new robot called the DOTS for Distributed Organization and Transport System. And these robots are more sophisticated. They have 4 cameras, they have a 16 laser time of flight range sensor, they've got 6 CPUs and a GPU, they've got the battery life, they're faster, they have a lifting platform. So they have this ability to better understand the world around them. And so we've designed this platform to explore this idea of out-of-the-box logistics. Here, what you're seeing is a swarm of them in the new arena that we've built. They're picking up these boxes and bringing them to the deposit area, only using onboard perception and computation. So everything is embedded in these systems. You can see this was a random walk. So this is actually random walks do very good if you got enough robots in your environment. So this is what we use as a baseline just to demonstrate some of the proof of concepts. But we're also thinking much more carefully about how you coordinate them. And so as part of this European project Emerge, about emergent awareness, we're thinking about how robots share minimal information. Those are all these little lines here. And based on that little information using Gaussian belief propagation, they gain an understanding about their spatial awareness as a swarm. And so that allows them to do things like know where the boxes are, or things like converge on a central coordinate frame. And knowing that information allows them to do things like shape formation, going straight to the boxes, drive their behavior to gain information. So we're augmenting swarms with more information through these local interactions so that they have a quasi-global view of the world without being global or centralized. So I think genuinely there's many areas that make sense in swarms for the real world. And there's kind of a tendency to think, or at least for me, because I'm excited about it, that we should just make it happen, right? But it's not just that. We need to understand how to make these trustworthy. And so as part of this work, we've been thinking about how do you make swarms safe? And that's both thinking about the ethical implications and legal applications, understanding if the individual is safe, but also its collective behavior. And then we've been looking at these three different categories of things that might help us with trustworthy systems. One is the swarm properties. So their ability to be proficient, robust, scalable, and adaptable. Thinking about how humans interact with swarms as a mechanism to make them more trustworthy, and thinking about how we test them formally in terms of specification, verification, and validation. So first on the swarm properties, here I have questions. I don't have answers. One is if your system is proficient. So if it performs its job in a high performance manner, that tends to impact the trustworthiness we have in the system. But sometimes centralized systems are perhaps more efficient if you really format the system to work for that environment. And so I think understanding how important proficiency is in human trust is going to be important. Robustness is also an open question. You might think that if your robots fail, but your system continues to operate, you trust it better. But perhaps seeing that robots fail makes you trust the system less. And so it's unclear in what way that will help or hinder our ability to trust the system. Scalability, the fact that you can add and remove agents and the system continues to work. That might be a great thing in terms of how a human trusts the system because it works. But you can add lots of robots, and having lots of robots might make for an untrustworthy system because it's hard to wrap your head around. And then adaptability is great because your system works again. If you change the environment, if you change things slightly, it works. So does that help people trust it? Or do they not trust it because your system is slightly unpredictable and behaves a bit differently in every environment? So these are all open questions that we have about humans and swarms. On the human swarm interaction side, we're actually running trials right now at the Bristol Robotics Laboratory, looking at the coordination of robots and how that impacts our ability to trust a swarm. So without giving too much away, these are two strategies to do the cloakroom exercise, and people come and deposit their valuables in our cloakroom, and they observe what the swarm does and tell us how trustworthy it is through well-known questionnaires. And in this system, the robots move in different ways. One is much more organic, a little bit random, and the other one is more structured in its movement, a little bit closer to what you'd imagine a centralized system doing. And we're exploring which one of these two people trust. So watch this space. The trials are ongoing for the next month. On how you control swarms, it's hard to define what trust is for an operator or a user. And so we were hoping that the operator would tell us what their version of trust is. In the cloakroom world, maybe they value a system being safer rather than being faster, or maybe they value the energy cost of that system. And what this gives us, this ability for the operator to tell us what they think makes for a more trustworthy system, is a fitness metric. And then what we can use is map elites, which allows us to illuminate all the possible combinations of solutions that we might want to put forward towards these criteria. And that lets the operator not just get one optimal control, but get a library of controllers that they can navigate to choose the control that they think makes for a more trustworthy cloakroom in that case. On the specification, verification, and validation, we've been looking at how you formally specify emergent behaviors of systems. So we're not looking at the individuals, we're looking purely at the emergent behaviors. And this is inspired from how they do it in machine learning, because they have a similar challenge of not knowing quite what the system will learn. And so we've taken this framework, AMLAS, and adapted it to swarms. It's now called EROS. And because we have specifications, we have lots of things that we need to meet as requirements for our cloakroom. So for example, we don't want all the robots to aggregate by a fire exit, would be an emergent property of your swarm that you want to make sure doesn't happen. And because we have these specifications, we've also been doing formal verification with Kirsten Eder and her team and Shane Windsor, looking at how you do formal verification and then how you do simulation-based in verification in low fidelity, high fidelity, and then all the way to reality. And we've done this full pipeline from formal verification to low fidelity, high fidelity, and reality to understand whether our specifications are met or not met. We're looking at fault detection so that we can, even though we say they're robust and scalable and adaptable, they are not always, and there are critical failures sometimes if some of your robots are failing. So we've been looking at how robots can detect themselves as faulty and how we can fix those faults through mitigation strategies. And then we've been looking at the socio-technical elements. So Pete Winter and John Downer come and study us, the engineers, as we develop these systems to really understand what are the key structural, organizational, technological, epistemic, and cultural frameworks that are needed in the design of these technologies. So I'm in a stage where if we put these to reality, when I talk to industry, they're like, what are your KPIs? And they want, you know, performance, cost, speed, energy, the classical ones you would get in industry. But I'm looking if we can design these SPI, swarm performance indicators, that measure with metrics, and we have a paper here on arXiv, what the robustness of your system is, the scalability, the adaptability, what the setup cost is of these systems, so that we can also assess the out-of-the-boxness of the system. And it's been fun doing these indicators, and I've been talking to industry, are these useful for you? And it's quite interesting because they'll say, actually, the only thing that matters is the performance of the system, right? And the productivity is the word I was looking for. And then I'm like, well, what kills your productivity? It's like when robots fail. And I'm like, so you're interested in robustness. So I think these are the things that we're trying to tease out in terms of bringing swarms to reality. And then there's trust performance indicators, and we don't have good ways of measuring this. I would claim across the board, and most of it is qualitative and very hard to put a number against. So this is something that I'd like to have a bit of fun with in the future. We're interested in what the world looks like, or our cities look like, if you have a robot at every corner street helping us move goods around. And the parallel to that, if you live in a big city, you might have scooters at every corner street that people jump on and move to somewhere in the city. And so they've been very good at moving people around in a very distributed way. But what would it look like for robots? And what would we do with these robots if you had a local request to, you know, bring your pair of jeans to your neighbor you've decided to swap jeans with, bring your curry to your neighbor, your elderly neighbor who might enjoy it. Maybe you can store things that are no longer in use in a communal warehouse. Maybe you can go to your local bakery and have it bring back a croissant. So what does the world look like when goods move in a very efficient manner at a local level? We do lots of engagement. I won't come into this. I wanted to highlight that a lot of this work on the trustworthy aspect was done as part of this task known in evolving functionality that was led by Shane Windsor, and had many exciting researchers across disciplines, as well as the broader work that I've presented to you that was delivered by the Swarm team and our collaborators. So thank you very much.